Welcome everybody to this session about consuming graph and third-party APIs from SPFx. First of all, we need to say a huge thank you to all of the sponsors that make this event possible. And I want to remind all of you about the code of conduct for this event and generally speaking for all the Collab Days events. Few words about myself. I'm Paolo Pialorsi. I work in a company of my own called psys.com. And I'm mainly a consultant providing support to companies moving to the cloud and to Microsoft 365, specifically from a developer point of view. I'm a certified master on SharePoint, as well as a proud member of the Microsoft 365 PMP team, an MVP on Office App and Services, and I do stuff on IT. I've been doing stuff on IT since the last 20 or 25 years because I'm getting older. And if you like, you can follow me on Twitter at Paolo Pia, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel where I publish on a weekly basis technical videos about the topics that I cover. So let's move to the content of this session. And let's start talking about how we can consume Microsoft Graph and other APIs from SPFx. First of all, we need to know that from a SharePoint Framework point of view, it's really easy using a web part or a SharePoint Framework extension to consume an external API and specifically Microsoft Graph. And this is a really powerful capability that we have whenever we want to build, in my opinion, real business level solutions. So let's start having a look, a very quick look at the behavior of SharePoint Framework whenever you consume Microsoft Graph. And then we will dig into the details and we will see how you can implement your own solutions leveraging these capabilities. So let me switch to my browser and hopefully you will be able to see it soon. Here it is. And here I am in a solution which is based on a sample solution provided by PMP. The solution is called SharePoint Starter Kit. And in this solution, we have a bunch of sample web parts and extensions which consume Microsoft Graph or other APIs that you can use to take inspiration from. Here, for example, you can see that in this part of the screen, I have my personal email web part through which I can see what the messages in my inbox are using a web part in a modern page. And this is exactly a SharePoint Framework, a custom web part that we built and that we make available in the starter kit that you can use to learn and to see how to consume Microsoft Graph. Just to give you an idea of what is happening under the cover, here in this page, my web part is leveraging an infrastructure provided by SharePoint Framework, which will get an access token to consume the Microsoft Graph on behalf of the currently connected user. So just to start talking about technical stuff, using a delegated access token to access the target resource. And it is so true that if I press F12 on this browsing session and if I go to the application, I can see in the session storage that I can search for a key in my session storage, that I can see that here I have something that looks like, and it is actually an access token. We will dig into the content of this access token later on in this session, but we see that in the session storage of my browsing session, I have an access token that allows my browser and my browsing section to access Microsoft Graph and to retrieve the list of email messages in my inbox. How does it work? How can we do that using SharePoint Framework and developing our own solutions? Well, first of all, what happens under the cover is that whenever a user browses to SharePoint Online, under the cover, the SharePoint Framework infrastructure will leverage ADAL, so Active Directory Authentication Library, which I know it's an old library, but Microsoft already said that they are working on moving from ADAL to MSAL. Sooner or later, it will happen, and it should be a transparent transition for us as developers. So it will simply switch from ADAL to MSAL. We will not see, hopefully, we will not see any changes from our point of view, but the engine under the cover will start using MSAL. But right now, it is based on ADAL.js, and it uses ADAL.js to get an access token from Azure Active Directory. Using that access token, we will be able to consume the API. But in order to get the access token, first of all, Azure Active Directory will do a check, will verify if we are requesting an access token for a resource that we can consume from SharePoint Framework. And if we can consume that resource, we will get back the access token. If not, we will get back an exception indeed. But with the access token, then we can make any kind of REST API request as long as we have proper permissions in the access token to consume the target API, which is the part that we need to understand. We need to understand how to make a request to get an access token to consume that resource, and we need to understand how we can configure the permissions that we need in order to consume the target API. But once we are good with the access token, we can go and consume Micrograph, Power BI, or whatever else API that we want to access and we want to consume. So let me dig a little bit more into the details of how the sample that I showed you works under the cover. And as such, first of all, let me show you the source code of the starter kit, and let me focus my attention to the personal email web part that we were using before. So in the starter kit, as I told you, we have quite a lot of web parts and extensions available and to take inspiration from. The personal email is the one we were having a look before. The personal email web part in SharePoint Framework uses an object of type MS Graph Client, which is available in this @Microsoft SPHTTP namespace. And what we need to do in order to consume, for example, the Microsoft Graph within SharePoint Framework is to get an instance of this type, which will be the client, which will allow us to consume Graph. In order to get that client, we have in the context of SharePoint Framework, so you see this .context is the context of SPFx, we have an MS Graph Client factory object, which we can use as a factory, so it will build for us an instance of an object, and specifically of an MS Graph Client object type. As such, we just say get client in order to get an instance of the object. And once we have, hopefully we get a running instance of the MS Graph client, then we can use it. How? In this example, we rely on a React component. As such, we provide the instance of the Graph client as an input property for the React component that does the actual rendering of our web part. So in the web part React component, the personal email TSX file, we have a load messages method that we will invoke whenever we want to refresh the list of messages that we want to show in the UI. And in these load messages, we simply rely on the Graph client object that we created before using the Graph MS Graph client factory. And using this Graph client, we simply need to use a Fluent API to declare what is the URL of the API that we want to consume. For example, in order to get the email messages in the mailbox of a user, we need to use the me/messages. And you can find documentation about how to use the different endpoints of Microsoft Graph if you will go to graph.microsoft.io or .com, up to you. Then we define what the API is, the API URL is. We define what the version will be. So if we will use the version 1 or the beta version of the Microsoft Graph. Then we can specify additional settings for the Graph request that we will make. Like, for example, the OData select parameter to define which properties we want to retrieve from the target result set. If we want to do any paging, like we do here, we get by default the top 5 messages. If we want to do any kind of sorting and stuff like that. Once you have configured the request, the Graph request using this Fluent API, you simply make a GET request. And of course, you can also do other kind of requests, like, for example, a POST or a PUT, and we will see shortly what you can do. So once you do that, you get back a response, which will be the actual JSON response that you get from the HTTP request that you send to the REST API of Microsoft Graph. And by doing that, you will be able to bind the result into the UI of your solution, which is what we do right here. So we get the response, which will be a collection of messages. The collection of messages will be made of an array of high message types with these properties, and then we just do the data binding. When we do the request here to get the client, under the cover there will be the handshake to get the access token in order to being able to consume the Microsoft Graph, based on a set of permissions that we have to declare in the package solution JSON file of our SPFx solution. So here in the Web API permission requests property, we need to declare all of the permission scopes that we want to have in order to being able to consume the graph and to do what we actually want to do in our web part. And an admin, and we will see that later on, will have to consent, will have to grant those permissions to our SharePoint Framework component. So here, as a developer, I simply make a request. I simply declare a requirement for my solution in order to properly work. But later on, an administrator will have to consent those permissions to my component. Otherwise, my component will not work. And I should be careful writing the code of my solution, and I should be able to handle those kind of exceptions, meaning that if I try to access a resource for which the admin didn't give me the permission, I should fail in a proper way rather than just crashing, okay? So this is the under the cover of the demo that we just saw. And in fact, if we go back to the session storage, and we see that here we just saw it, that we have this adil.access.token. If we copy the value of this token, so let me do that. And if I go to jwt or jot.ms, here we can see in a safe way, because our access token will be just processed client side, that in the access token, we have the information about the target audience, which is the Microsoft Graph, of course, because it is the API that we want to consume. We see the issuer, which will be the tenant in which I am. I can see that from a permission scope point of view, I have this list of permissions, which is actually the list of permissions that I declared in my Web API permission request property of the package solution JSON file. And under the cover, there will be in the Azure Active Directory tenant where I'm running my solution, an application registered with these permission scopes granted, which will be used to consume the Microsoft Graph. So let me dig a little bit more into the details. And what is happening under the cover is that from a SharePoint Framework point of view, by default, there is a unique application registered in Azure Active Directory, which is an application automatically registered for us by Microsoft, by the SharePoint Framework infrastructure. And in fact, if I go to portal.azure.com, I go to Azure Active Directory, and I go into the enterprise applications, I can search for all applications, and specifically for an application called SharePoint Online Client something. Here it is, SharePoint Online Client Accessibility Web Application Principal. Most likely one of the longest application names in Azure Active Directory. If I click on it, I can see that this application, which is registered by Microsoft in our tenants, has a set of permissions granted, which includes the permissions that I declared in my package solution.json file, and which are defined in the access token that I'm using to consume Microsoft Graph from SharePoint Framework. So what happens under the cover is that whenever I create through the factory object an instance of the MS Graph client object, the SharePoint Framework using ADIL will use the application that I just showed you in Azure Active Directory to make a request to get an access token, a delegated access token, so that it will be an access token which will be used on behalf of the currently connected user. In that access token, there will be the permission scopes configured for and granted to the application that we see right now, the SharePoint Online Client Accessibility Web Application Principal. And using that access token, under the cover, the MS Graph client object will be able to make a request to the Microsoft Graph. Now, how can we grant and assign those permissions to the SharePoint Online Client Accessibility Web Application Principal is a topic that we will cover later on, near to the end of the session. But right now, bear in your mind that as a developer, you need to create an instance of the MS Graph client object. You need in your solution to declare the Web API permission request that you need. an admin will have to grant those permissions, and when an admin will grant those permissions, the application registered by Microsoft in your tenant will be granted those permissions and will be used through ADIL by the SharePoint Framework infrastructure to get an access token and to let you call the Microsoft Graph, let you invoke the Microsoft Graph using that access token. That's what happens under the cover when you consume Microsoft Graph. But there is more to say about the MS Graph client object. First of all, it has been introduced in SharePoint Framework 1.6, so it has been around for a while already, and it uses internally that Fluent API, which looks like a kind of a special version of the Microsoft Graph SDK in SharePoint Framework. It has quite a lot of members available to do stuff like playing with open data protocols, select, expand, order by, filter, top, skip, so on and so forth. And it provides us with methods like post, put, get, so that we can properly interact with the target API that we want to use. We can also do deletion, you see, del, or we can do stuff targeting the endpoints of Microsoft Graph. When we use this object, as I told you, we have a set of permission scopes in the delegated access token that an admin has to grant to us. We cannot use an application-only access token. So if you are wondering if it is possible to do stuff with app-only access token, no, it is not possible. Using SharePoint Framework, client-side code, we need to behave and we need to work on behalf of the currently connected user. So this is a really common scenario whenever you want to consume Microsoft Graph. However, a lot of businesses, at least based on my own experience, a lot of businesses want to be able to consume not only the Microsoft Graph, but also third-party APIs like line of business systems. So, and again, using SharePoint Framework, and regardless if you are in a web part or in an extension, you can easily use an Azure Active Directory registered application, which will give you access to an API, which will provide you the capability to consume a backend system like a line of business system. And you can do that using almost the same technique that we saw before while consuming the Microsoft Graph, but targeting any other third-party API, as long as the third-party API is properly registered in Azure Active Directory. So how can we do that? In order to consume Microsoft Graph, we have the MS Graph client object. In order to consume any other API registered in Azure Active Directory, we have the AAD HTTP client, Azure Active Directory HTTP client. This is the client object that we use to consume any other API which is not Graph. Actually, we could use it to consume Graph as well if you like. And there are some edge cases where you really want to do that. But generally speaking, whenever you want to consume Microsoft Graph, you use the MS Graph client object. Whenever you want to use and consume any other API, you use the AAD HTTP client object. You create an instance of the AAD HTTP client object using a factory as you do with Graph. The factory now is called AAD HTTP client factory and is still available in the context of SPFx. And then you simply make your REST request to consume the target API. The key point is how you get and how you configure your SharePoint Framework solution in order to have proper permissions and proper permission scopes to consume the target API. In fact, whatever is the API that you want to consume, you will still need to have an access token. You will still need to have a permission scope to consume that API. And as such, there will be an admin granting that permission to SharePoint Framework and to your solution. So let me show you another sample and let's dig into this topic. So here I have another SharePoint Framework solution. In this solution, I have a really simple web part, just for the sake of explaining you the topic, in which I use Microsoft Graph or a third-party API, and I will show you what is happening under the cover of this web part. First of all, here we use the Microsoft Graph client if we want to consume Microsoft Graph, but we can also use AAD HTTP client, which is still available in the same namespace as before. And we can create an instance of this AAD HTTP client type simply using the AAD HTTP client factory and getting a new client. Now, there is a small difference. When you want to get an MS Graph client instance, you simply say get client, because Microsoft Graph is just one. But if you want to get a client in order to consume a target API, a third-party API, you need to specify what the API is. And that's why here I say, dear factory, give me a client for a specific target API that I want to consume. And you have to provide what is called the unique URI of the target API. This is the information that usually you register in Azure Active Directory whenever you register an application. And we will see how and where you can do that for your third-party APIs that you want to consume. So we get a client object, which will be an instance of this type. And as before, we provide this object to the React component, which does the actual rendering of our solution. So if we want to consume the target API, for example, we want to consume an Azure function that I will show you later on, we simply need to rely on that AAD HTTP client instance, and we make a REST request, which can be, again, a GET, a PUT, or any of the available HTTP methods that we can use to invoke a target REST API. So we will have to provide the URL. It is less fluent, this syntax. We will have to explicitly provide the URL of the target API, REST API. We need to specify the version of the configuration that we want to use, and right now this is the only one we have, and eventually some request options, like, for example, a set of custom HTTP headers to specify that we want to get back a JSON response from the target API. So let's have a look to the target API first, and then let's come back to SharePoint Framework and see how we can consume that API. If I go to my Azure portal right here, I have my Azure function. This Azure function is configured to provide just one function, which will give me back just a fake list of customers coming out from yet another fake Northwind customers database. So I simply process a request with a C# based function. I get a request and I provide as a response just a fake array of customer objects with the properties that most likely you know if you have already seen the well-known and famous Northwind customers database. Plus, I want to show you that in the target API, in the target function, I can get information about the user who is consuming my API. And as such, I read the claims principal.current.claims to read and provide back to the consumer, to the customer, to the client of my API, the claims of the user who is invoking my function. This function is configured in Azure Active Directory as an API available in my target tenant. So if I will go to my target tenant, I can show you that under app registrations in this tenant, I registered an application called SPFx lob function with a specific ID. If I go to the settings of this application, I can see that this one exposes an API. This is the application ID URI of my API, and this is exactly the value I'm providing right here whenever I get a client for my target API. Okay, and I expose my API with the custom permission scope, which is exactly this one, the user underscore impersonation, which is the default one, meaning that in order to consume this API, you will have to provide to this API an access token, specifically a delegated access token, with this permission scope in its definition. Okay? So I have the application registered in Azure Active Directory. I have the function configured in Azure. There are some small additional requirements that I will tell you later on, but this Azure function is the one I'm calling whenever I am in my client-side web part in my React component, and I say, give me the list of customers. This will be the URL of the list of customers in my through my custom function, which I'm invoking using SharePoint Framework. once I've got back the response, it is just a JSON response which I process and which I use. So let me do gulp serve no browser for this sample solution. And let me show you how it behaves in the browser. Almost ready. Now I can refresh in my target tenant the SharePoint workbench, and I can add my custom web part, which is play something. So it should be play with OAuth tokens. Okay. This web part needs to be configured in order to have the URL of the function. So let me grab the URL of the function from here. This is the URL of my function. Let me use it. Okay, you see that if I call this function from a, for example, an incognito browsing session, I will have to authenticate. I will have to provide a set of credentials from an Azure Active Directory point of view, because this is an API, this is a function which is not available for anonymous users. So I need to provide a token, an access token, in order to be able to consume the API. Now that the URL is configured, I can click on the Call Azure Function button. It will have to warm up the function. And now you can see I am the user, Paolo at whatever. There are 5 customers in my fake response, and here are the 5 customers. Under the cover, if we press F12 again, we go into application, we go into session storage, we search for ADAL again, like we did before. You can see that now I have an access token for my function, for my app, rather than for Micrograph. And again, if I copy the value of this access token and I go to jot.ms, we can see that now this access token targets my custom API in a specific tenant, which is the one that issued the token. And if I go into the permission scope section, I can see that this token defines a permission to use the user underscore impersonation permission scope, which is the one required by my target API in order to consume it and to get the list of customers. So it is happening exactly what was happening before with Micrograph, but now I am using the AAD HTTP client rather than the MS Graph client. Under the cover, there is a lot of plumbing, which is well hidden from me and from us, which is happening under the cover in order to do the handshake to get the access token and to make it possible for me to invoke the target API. In fact, if I go to the package solution.json file, we can see that now in the web API permission request, I have still a permission for graph because I need it for another section of this demo, but I also have a permission for the resource, which is called SPFx lob function, which is exactly the name of my app in Azure Active Directory of the target tenant. And I have the scope that I want to have in order to access the target API. So here I'm simply declaring the permission scope that I need in order to consume the target API. Then again, we will see that an admin will have to grant these permissions to my target application. And what will happen under the cover will be that, again, if I go to my Azure Active Directory tenant and if I search for enterprise application, as I did before, I search for SharePoint online something, client extensibility web application principle, okay, that one. We can see in the permissions that now this application principle will also have the permission to consume my line of business function, and not only the graph permissions, but also this one. So, key message, regardless the API that you consume, by default, I want to stress the information, by default, and we will see why I'm saying by default, there is just one unique application in your tenant, in your Azure Active Directory, which is the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web Application Principle, which will get the grant to use any of the APIs, whether it is Graph or a third-party API that you want to consume. And this unique application principle is shared across all of the SharePoint Framework solutions that you have in your tenant. Meaning that if you have a web part which needs to consume the graph with a specific permission scope, or which needs to consume a third-party API with a specific permission scope, what will happen will be that any other SharePoint Framework solution running in your tenant will be able to have access to that API, which is not always the best thing to do. And that's why, in a few minutes from now, I will explain you what you can do to isolate your permission requests. But still talking about the consumption of APIs, there are scenarios where you want, for example, to just get the access token and to make a low-level request with your own code base without using the infrastructure provided by SharePoint Framework. If that is the case, there is a third object, which is the AD token provider type, that you can use to just retrieve an access token, and then you can use the access token to do whatever you like to do. You create it using a token provider factory. So as before, you just create an instance, you just get an instance of the object through a factory. And once you have the AD token provider object, you can just use it to get an access token for a target resource. Let me show you what I mean. Still in this example, I can create an instance of the AD token provider type using the factory, AD token provider factory, with the get token provider method. I will not specify here the target API for which I want the token provider factory. I will simply get an instance of the object, which I provide to the React component like always. And in the React component, I can say, dear access token provider, AD token provider, give me a token for a specific app, which can be the Microsoft Graph if you like, or which can be any other API of your own or a third-party one. And you will simply have to provide the unique URI of the target API. By doing that, you will get back an access token, which you can use because you want to store it somewhere, because you want to provide it to a backend API or whatever else. Doesn't really matter. Or because you want to make a low-level HTTP request, not using the HTTP client or the MS Graph client, but you want to use a low-level HTTP client because you have to do something special. You never know, okay? So this is the third option you have. So MS Graph client to consume Microsoft Graph, AAD HTTP client to consume any other third-party API, and AAD token provider if you want to get just the access token and do your magic by yourself, okay? That said, we already saw that whenever we want to consume an API, we need to declare in the package solution.json file the web API permission request. When you do that, you simply declare what the requirements are for your solution. You don't provide those specific permissions to the application principal in any of the target tenants. But what will happen under the cover will be that if you build your solution, let me go to the other one, sorry about that. Let me stop this one. If you do gulp bundle ship, and then you do gulp package solution ship, hopefully it will be fast enough to not waste our time waiting. Let's see. Okay, and gulp package solution ship. Once you have done that, you can go, package solution ship. Okay, wonderful. We have a problem. Let me see if I already have a package. Otherwise, I will use another one. I don't want to dig into any of the issues right now because time is running fast. Okay, so what's the problem? Might be that I have something wrong in the package solution file, most likely. But, well, I don't want to dig right now into this issue because time is running fast. But the idea is that when you drag and drop your SPPKG file into the target app catalog of your tenant, an admin will see that there is a requirement for your application to grant some specific permissions in order to run it. And as an admin, you will be able to go to this UI, which I'm going to show you. So right here, if you go to the admin UI of your tenant, let me do that. -admin.sharepoint.com. In the modern admin UI, under advanced, you have API access. And here you can see as an admin, you will be able to see if there are any pending permission requests. And for example, here I have some of them. So I can choose one of the permission requests. I can see that it is a permission request for graph, for on behalf of a specific package or a specific application with a specific target permission. And as an admin, I can approve or I can reject this permission request. If I will approve the permission request, the permission will be granted to the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web Application Principal. If I will reject it, of course, it will not be granted. As you can see here, I already have quite a lot of permissions granted at tenant level. And you can always change your mind, select a permission and remove the permissions that you previously granted. You can do that also using PowerShell if you like, and you can do that using the provisioning engine of PnP if you want to use that one. So plenty of options, okay? Now, the point is, okay, you configure in the package solution.json file the permissions that you need. You create the package, you upload the package in the app catalog, you come here or you use PowerShell or the provisioning engine to grant those permissions, and then using a factory object, you create whether the MS Graph client, the AD client, or the AD token provider, and you get the access token and you consume the API. Wonderful. But as I said, every user and every SharePoint Framework solution will have exactly the same set of permissions, which are those granted to this application, which is not always optimal. So what can we do to create a better solution and a safer and more secure solution? Let me switch back to my presentation. And what you can do is creating a so-called isolated web part. Well, an isolated web part is a web part where you want to have an exclusive set of permissions, meaning that rather than granting the permissions that you declare in the package solution.json file to any SharePoint Framework solution, you want to have your own application principal in Azure Active Directory, and you want to grant the permissions you need to that specific application that you own, that uniquely represents your custom solution. They are called isolated web parts, but actually the same topic applies to extensions, if you like. So how can you do that? Well, when you declare a solution as an isolated one, SharePoint Framework, when you deploy the solution in the app catalog, will create for you a dedicated application, will register for you a dedicated application in Azure Active Directory, and will grant your permissions. If an admin will say, yes, we'll approve the permission request, the permissions will be assigned, will be granted to a dedicated application principal in your Azure Active Directory. And as such, your package, your solution will be the only one with the permissions to consume that specific API that you wanted to use. When you do that, your web part will be rendered inside an iframe with a dedicated DNS name, so that you will be able, or actually Azure Active Directory and the infrastructure of SharePoint Framework will be able to uniquely identify if your solution is the one consuming the target API, and as such, it will grant your solution to get access to that API, or for any other API, any other solution, the permission will not be granted because you will not use the proper URL, the proper DNS name from a course point of view. So that's what happens under the cover. Let me show you what is happening in practice. So if we have a look at this solution I was playing with, the second one, in the package solution.json file, we have is domain isolated equal true. This flag instructs SharePoint Framework to isolate the solution, meaning that if we go into the target tenant where we were using the application, and we go to search for the applications, we can see that we have the SPFx AAD something registered in our target tenant. This is the application created on the fly by the SharePoint Framework infrastructure in our target tenant. This application is registered to have the permission to use graph and my line of business function. So this is a dedicated application in Azure Active Directory for my custom solution. And in my SharePoint my Azure function, right here, in the settings of my function, in the course settings, I can declare that I want to make it possible to consume this function from this URL, which is a specific URL and a specific dedicated DNS name for my isolated application. And it is so true that if I go back here and I run again gulp serve, no browser, okay, almost there, perfect, and I refresh my Workbench page, of course, my web part is still configured, so I can consume my function, I can get an access token, and I can use the access token. But if we look with F12 into the source code of our solution, we should be able to find an iframe. Here it is, not this one, most likely a next one. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Okay, should be somewhere here. Well, we don't see it right now, but maybe if we go here, we can see that we are consuming our API through a different endpoint. Let me see. Okay, let me try to refresh the page. And let me call the Azure function from here. Okay, we should be able to see, here it is. No, not this one, but this one. We see the call to the list of Northwind customers. And this is a request targeting my API. And the request is coming from my Office Dev PMP tenant. And here we can see that this is one of the course configurers, like as the unique DNS for my application. In the settings of my Azure function, I also configured under authentication and authorization in Azure Active Directory that we want to use Azure Active Directory, and the Azure AD application that we want to use to authenticate access to this API, to this function, is this one, which is exactly the one we have in our Azure Active Directory tenant right here. If we search for our application SPFx lob function. This is the application ID that we configured here. So basically, we are using Azure Active Directory to authenticate. We have a dedicated application configured in Azure Active Directory for our SharePoint Framework solution. To that dedicated application, thanks to a grant made by an admin, we have the permissions granted to consume the line of business function. And as such, our SharePoint Framework solution will be the only one allowed to consume our API. Any other SharePoint Framework solution will not be able to consume our target API. So that was it. Through this flow, you can easily consume Microsoft Graph, you can easily consume third-party APIs, and you can use an isolated approach in order to have dedicated permissions for your SharePoint Framework solutions, in order to not share your permissions with other SharePoint Framework solutions. And as such, you can easily build business-level solutions with SharePoint Framework, which can consume any external API secured through Azure Active Directory. Of course, I want to say thank you for watching this session. Let me see if there are any questions in the channel. No, I don't see any. Thomas,
no, I don't think we had any questions. Let me double check.
I didn't see any, but
no, I don't think so. So
okay.
That means that everything was crystal clear, right?
Or maybe nobody was listening. Who knows?
No. There were definitely people listening. I can check that. So no worries there. You were not alone.
Okay.
So
all right.
I
hope you enjoyed. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being part of the event. And be sure, and that's for the attendees, be sure to, if you have any additional questions, you can still ask them in the Discord channel, and Paolo will be watching that in the next few minutes to see if we forgot something. All right, thank you very much, Paolo, and well, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Omita Framework is an enterprise-ready software platform that makes it possible to set up an easy integration between your existing back-office applications and push all the relevant information into digital workplaces. Omita has developed various kinds of solutions which can be easily deployed and linked to your back-office applications. Omita has solutions for contract management, HR, to speed up onboarding and offboarding processes, sales dashboards, shop floor portals, and many more. If you want more information, visit our website.